Well, the global grain prices have rallied after Russia's refusal to renew the Black Sea grain deal. The increase has also triggered a jump in local grain prices. Experts say that this may undermine the gains for emerging markets of stabilising grain prices through the deal. So let's look at the possible impact of this. We're going to be joined for that via Zoom by AgriSA's Chief Executive Officer, Christo van der Rheede. Christo, good afternoon. Thank you for your time with us here on the SABC.
Good afternoon, and good afternoon to all of your viewers.
We're trying to understand the implications for the world at large, perhaps also South Africa at this point, just in a post-COVID-19 reality. And I wonder if you could speak to what this impact is going to look like for South Africa. When are we also going to start feeling the impact thereof?
Remember the Black Sea Grain Initiative, it was sort of brokered by the UN and Turkey. And that assisted the Ukraine to export their wheat to the countries that they export to. And it also allowed Russia to export its grains to various parts of the world. And this, to a very large extent, alleviated or brought relief to the crisis that we faced when the war broke out, because a number of developing countries are highly dependent on wheat from Ukraine as well as Russia. You take Egypt, for example, I think they import approximately 80% of their grains, and a number of other African countries and Asian countries, as well as China, depend on huge amounts of grains from those areas. So we've seen a massive spike in the price of wheat, also spike in the price of edible oils. And this has sort of tapered down when this deal was brokered. But unfortunately, if Russia is not going to allow for any exports via the Black Sea, this may pose a serious threat to prices and a serious threat to food security in many countries.
Christo, thank you for that context and for also just speaking to which food items will be most affected. I know that despite South Africa's large domestic grain supplies, we won't be insulated from the disruption, perhaps in the weeks and months to come. And I wonder, on the back of the announcement not to renew the grain deal, though, what was the price reaction to the news?
Well, we've seen already a 3% increase in the price of wheat on global markets. And you're right, South Africa, we've imported approximately 30% of our wheat from the Ukraine and as well as Russia. But our domestic farmers, they've responded quite well in that they've immediately started to plant more wheat during the previous season. And I think they will continue to plant wheat even more during this season. And yes, we expect in the region of 2.5 million tons. That is not sufficient for domestic use. But we have secured imports from other countries, such as Mexico, Poland, and so forth. So yes, South Africa is relatively secured in terms of wheat supplies, but the rest of, or many other countries on the African continent are not. And that, pose a threat, as I've said earlier, in terms of food security.
No, absolutely. And I want to look at some of those countries, perhaps also what the end of the Black Sea grain deal means for the World Food Programme, perhaps also those in need, as I alluded to. Most countries are living in a post-COVID-19 reality at this point.
Indeed. If you take, for example, Nigeria. Nigeria, I've just read in the newspapers that Nigeria at this point in time is experiencing quite a severe food shortage. That is due to these global or geopolitical troubles that we have been experiencing, but also due to certain local factors. For example, the government decided at some stage that they're not going to subsidize fuel any longer. And that has resulted in less plantings, also farmers not being able to cope with the ever increasing prices of fuel. And that now has resulted in a food crisis in that country. If you take Somalia, for example, Ethiopia, Sudan, all of those countries depend on food or wheat imports and imports of other products from Ukraine specifically and Russia. So yes, we face a serious challenge, and I think it's important that the UN, Turkey, and even China and African countries put pressure on Russia, and that they broker some deal, because on the one hand, Russia is calling for their banking system to be reconnected to the SWIFT system. And on the other hand, we want Russia to allow for exports of wheat from that region via the Black Sea. So they have to come to a compromise, otherwise the world is going to suffer.
Well, speaking of which, let me just wrap up our conversation on the back of the sentiments echoed, because there is now an impact on global food prices. In your opinion, can the Ukraine at all move grain through Europe in alternative measures? What else could be explored in the interim?
Yeah, I think they are in a position to export via Poland. But obviously, if they have to do that, it's going to push up the cost of wheat, which will have a spillover impact, obviously, on the landing cost of wheat price in those areas that, or in those countries that depend on these imports from the Ukraine. But I think they need to come to a compromise, because this war is going on for too long, and it is really in no one's interest. We've seen the destruction in Ukraine, the loss of life. We've seen how it has really turned the entire global economic system upside down. We've seen rising inflation all over the world, and who suffers at the end of the day? Not those who's got the political power in their hands, but the poorest of the poor. And I think Russia, as well as all the other parties involved in this conflict, need to come to their senses to avoid a global food crisis.